Today we're going to take a look at the Anbernic RG35XX H. Let's get to it. The Anbernic RG35XX H is a Linux-based handheld gaming device. It has a 3.5-inch display. It's powered by a quad-core 64-bit Cortex A53 CPU that runs at 1.5 GHz, and it has 1 GB of LPDDR4 RAM. Couple of items worth calling out. The 3.5-inch IPS display runs at a resolution of 640 by 480. It has 2 TF or micro SD card slots, and there's a 3300 mAh battery in here that advertises upwards of 8 hours of game time. For ports, we're looking at 2 USB-C, a 3.5-inch mm headphone jack, and HDMI. It supports Bluetooth 4.2 and both Wi-Fi 2.4 and 5G, and all of this weighs in at 180 grams. First off, let's talk about the OOBE. For folks who are unfamiliar with what an OOBE is, it's the out-of-box experience you have from the time you take the device out of its packaging up to the point where you can actually use the device for its core purpose or for what it was advertised as. The out-of-box experience for the RG35XX H was fairly straightforward. It came in a plain box that's not too much bigger than the device itself. Our unit also came with a USB charging cable, a screen protector, a 64 GB SD card, and a user manual. It booted right up, and we were at the main screen in under a minute. Before we get to the rest of the video, I want to mention our Patreon. As a subscriber, you'll be listed as a producer of our content. You'll also get access to our custom game cover art that we've put together over the years. You'll likely see it in action in some of our videos. This art works great with custom launchers and really goes a long ways in making a digital game collection look awesome. So click on the link below, head on over to our Patreon, and become a producer today. Okay, back to the video. Much like the Plus model, the first thing we noticed when we picked up the device was the texture of the plastic. It's almost comparable to the texture of a Steam Deck. Maybe not as pronounced, but definitely not a completely smooth surface. It feels pretty good. The build quality feels mostly solid, but just like the Plus model, there are some buttons that rattle a bit when you shake it. The button layout is great for a small handheld, but it's also pretty standard, which is a good thing. On the front we have a D-pad, A-B-X-Y buttons, start and select buttons, and 2 thumbsticks. The volume buttons are on the left, and the power and reset buttons are on the right. Up top there's 4 shoulder buttons and a menu button. On the bottom we have the micro SD card slots, and up top to each side of the HDMI port we have the USB-C ports, and the headphone jack is on the far left. The D-pad seems to be a bit stiffer than the one on the Plus, but otherwise it feels the same. The A-B-X-Y buttons feel pretty firm, though they're not too stiff. They also have some decent height, but again not too much. The thumbsticks are along the bottom and they feel pretty good. They're also recessed, so they're out of the way when you're using the face buttons or the D-pad. The select and start buttons are easy to reach, and same goes for the menu button up top. The volume rocker is flat with the surface, but a gap in the center makes it easy to tell where you are without looking, and each side has nice feedback when pressed. The same can mostly be said of the power button. There's a little reset button just beneath the power button that's not super easy to press, but this is fine because it's not something that you'll want to ever accidentally press. The shoulder buttons have a slight wobble. It's not enough to be distracting, but you can hear them rattle if you shake the device. Otherwise, they have decent feedback when pressed, and R2 and L2 are slightly raised, making them easy to locate. The 3.5-inch IPS display is really nice. Nothing looks washed out, and in some games the colors really pop. It has 5 levels of brightness available, which do a good job of covering most day and nighttime scenarios. The sound is dual speaker based, and it's not too bad. It gets pretty loud and doesn't break up at the higher levels. In our opinion, it doesn't sound as good as some of the other devices in this category. It's not terrible by any means, but we do like it over the Plus model. We also want to call out the rubber pads on the back. This is a nice addition that keeps the device in place when you set it on a smooth surface. Overall though, this is a well-made little handheld. It fits nicely in the palm of our hands. We picked up the black model and love the sleek look of it. As we were making this video, Anbernic released a significant firmware update, 240222, so everything here is based on that update. The main screen has 6 sections: Game Rooms, RA Games, Favorites, History, Search, and Settings. The Game Room section groups games by emulator. It shows you a list of every emulator on the system, regardless of whether it has games available, and this can be a cumbersome way to look through your games. The RA Games section is dedicated to RetroArch, and it also groups games by emulator, but here it only shows emulators that have games currently available. There's also an option on the way in that gives you access to a few settings. For the most part, the RA Games section is where we ended up most of the time when picking games to play. The Favorite section shows a list of games that you've marked as favorite, along with an indicator of which section you set favorites from. A game that was marked favorite from the RA Games section will have a little yellow RA next to it in the upper title bar, where games from Game Room won't. This is a great way to manage your games, but it also sorts them by time added, not alphabetical, and currently there's no way to change that. The History section shows a list of most recently played games, and it's pretty straightforward. The Search section is great for sifting through larger game collections. It has a virtual keyboard that you navigate with the D-pad, and results are nice and fast. The last section is Settings. This is where you'll do things like change the screen timeout, adjust the brightness, and set the date, time, system language, and a few other similar settings. This is also where you'll find the Wi-Fi and Bluetooth settings. You can remap the buttons here, but there's no guidance. And while it's not intuitive at all, it's actually pretty simple. And we remapped things to ABXY instead of BAXY. Though it's worth calling out that not every layer of every emulator adheres to this remapping. You can also change the background, system icons, and button sounds from here as well. There's no over-the-air updating in the settings menu at the time that we made this video, but it seems like something that could possibly get added to a future OS update. The network subsettings also give you access to Moonlight. It's a nice feature, but with a limited screen size, it's not something we'd use much on a device like this. Settings is also where you'll go to start RetroArch, which opens another layer of settings and options. For the most part, you could ignore this if you want, because the system is fine out of the box, but there are a ton of useful settings here for those who like to tinker. It's also worth calling out that you can enable retro achievements from the user section in RetroArch. One of the best things about this class of handheld devices are the extended OS options. And while they're in a great state on the RG35XX, they're not quite feature complete here yet. At the time of this review, Batocera has a feature complete build that's now on the beta channel. So far in our testing, game performance is about the same as the stock OS, but there's a lot of nice OS level features. We might visit this in a separate video. It's worth mentioning that even with the latest 2024 update, we were never able to get Bluetooth speakers to work. They showed up in the device discovery list, but nothing happened when trying to connect any of our devices. Overall though, the stock OS is fine for now. It's serviceable, and it's probably all most gamers will likely need. But we'll try out other options a bit more in depth as they release more feature-rich builds. For our setup here, we have the main system files on TF1 and our ROMs on TF2. We used the new SD card and updated the system to the most recent update. We always recommend setting things up with your own ROMs. It's the best way to ensure you're playing the version of the games you want. To follow what we did here for games, power down the device, place a blank card into TF2, power it up, and the system does the rest in the background as soon as you're back at the main screen. Power the device back down, remove your SD card from TF2, and place it in an adapter on the PC where your ROMs are. You're going to see that there are already a bunch of directories on this card. From here, it's a matter of putting the right ROMs into the right folders. You can use the folder mapping at the OnionOS wiki as a guide. If you want your own custom art, make a folder within each ROM folder named IMGS. It associates ROM names with art names, so name your art the exact same name as the ROM file, except for the extension, and it'll show when you have the ROM selected. For example, this is what the ROM and art names are for Warcraft 2: The Dark Saga. Be mindful of the file size though, because larger art files can cause a slight lag in library navigation. Alright, eject the card from your PC, place it back into slot TF2, power up your RG35XX H, and you should be good to go. Overall, gaming was pretty good. Atari through PlayStation 1 games were the best experience, and while N64, PSP, and Dreamcast games had some games that were 100% playable, this is also the group where we saw the most performance issues, so your mileage here is going to depend on the game itself. We mostly use RetroArch for emulation, and more on this in a bit. RetroArch has a deeper in-game set of options to fine-tune your experience over the game room emulators. RetroArch settings give you access to things like crop overscan, NTSC filtering, and emulation hacks like SuperFX overclocking. We also want to call out Nintendo DS emulation. In our Plus review, we went into DS emulation thinking it probably wouldn't be the best experience on a device like this, and left with a very different perspective. They used Drastic as the emulator, and games that aren't touch or stylus heavy were a surprisingly good experience once we got the hang of screen switching. Every game that we tested was technically playable, but a couple, like Metroid Prime Hunters, were too dual screen and stylus heavy to be enjoyable. PSP games were more miss than hit. Games like Dante's Inferno and God of War had some major performance issues. On the flip side, PSP games that did run good were a great overall experience here. Let's go back to that bit about RetroArch earlier. Another reason as to why we mostly use RetroArch for emulation is for overall compatibility. With game room emulators, we occasionally ran into weird issues, like the controller not working in Diablo through the game rooms emulator, but working fine through RetroArch. Little issues like that. Anyhow, take everything we mentioned here into account, because while you can play some higher end games on here, there are a few that simply don't perform well. Outside of that though, games that ran well were generally impressive across the board, and we'd put the H at the top of its device class here for performance. In our testing, we saw about 6.5 hours of gameplay between charges. The game system and type is going to affect this though. Playing NES games can get you just over 7 hours, and playing PlayStation and Dreamcast games will drop it to below 5. We should also call out again that as of the 240222 update, we still saw more battery drain than we would like to see when using sleep mode. You'll get the best results by powering the device down when you're done playing by holding the power button down until you see the goodbye screen. So what's missing from the RG35XX H? Even though there's Wi-Fi here, there's no over-the-air updating. This would be a nice addition because, as it stands, the current process involves Google or Mega Drive, knowing which files to download, and how to apply them to an SD card, and it's definitely not something I'd expect most handheld gamers to want to do. Charging can be temperamental. You're going to need a USB-C to USB-A cable to charge this, because USB-C to C is still problematic. Takiyudon talks about this in depth in one of his videos, so we'll leave a link to it in the description below for you to go check out if you want to learn more. Even after the update, there's still way more battery drain in sleep mode than we'd like to see. Much like the Plus model, it wasn't consistent, but several times the battery was fully drained by letting it sleep overnight. Alright, so what are my final thoughts on the Anbernic RG35XX H? We liked the RG35XX Plus because it kept what worked from the RG35XX and added some features that make the refreshed version even better. But our preference leans towards horizontal handhelds, and the H model gives us just that. If you're okay with being limited to games up through Dreamcast, this should be at the top of your list of considerations if you're in the market for a pocketable handheld emulator. You can pick it up for $70 or less, depending on where you shop, which to us seems like a great price. The OS is a bit bare bones, but if this is anything like the RG35XX, you'll have some great options in the near future. Speaking of the previous model, if you already own an RG35XX, there's not really a huge reason to update to this one. Though if you held off because it was a vertical handheld and you prefer horizontal, then this one's for you. But there is that Bluetooth speaker issue for now. It seems like something that'll get resolved in an update, but for now, wireless audio isn't an option. And while we suspect it'll get addressed, we don't know for certain. At the end of the day though, the RG35XX H is one of the top devices in this category, and coming in at less than $70 US makes this easy to recommend if you're in the market for a device like this. If you're looking to play games up to the PlayStation 1 and Game Boy Advance, with a dash of PSP and Dreamcast games thrown in, you should absolutely consider the RG35XX H. And that about wraps things up. Please like this video if you found it useful, and subscribe to our channel if you want more content like this. I appreciate you taking the time to watch this, and we'll chat again soon.